Good afternoon and welcome to the third instalment of our supervisor training relating to our PhD and MPhil regulations. I'm Chris Lowry and I'm with Neil McLaughlin-Cook, our registrar. Hello Neil.
Hello Chris.
In today's session we're going to be looking at the monitoring of student progress, and Neil's going to give some of the background detail and some of the key points that you'll need to be aware of when you're supervising your students.
Okay, thanks Chris. You'll see that I've got one slide here summarising how we formally monitor progress, and then we'll look in detail at a couple of these, which are annual progress reviews and confirmation and registration. So you'll see that from this slide that there are technically three different procedures that we follow. One is the annual progress reviews, sometimes called annual monitoring, and this takes place for every student. In addition to that, there's either a confirmation of registration event or an application to transfer registration event, and those are for different groups of students. The confirmation of registration event is for students who are admitted direct to PhD registration at the start of their course. And the application to transfer registration event is for students who are admitted to read for an MPhil, but have decided they wish to transfer to a PhD. Now the procedures for the application to transfer registration event are basically the same as those for the confirmation of registration event, and the criteria for successful outcome are also pretty much the same. So this presentation, therefore, talks in detail about the annual progress reviews and the confirmation of registration event. So in terms of the annual progress reviews, first of all, if we look at the purpose of this, and you'll see this takes place really to fulfill four purposes. One is to make sure that students are on track in relation to working towards their thesis and in terms of meeting this university's expectations for the award of a PhD or MPhil as appropriate. Secondly, to confirm that they're on track in the development of research skills. Thirdly, to make sure that they have ethical approval of their current research. Now, this is not just a tick box exercise in which we note that at some point in the past they went through ethical approval. It's a matter of looking at the research they're doing now and forming a judgment as to whether the ethical approval they have obtained is still appropriate. And if not, an outcome might be that they would need to seek ethical approval again. And the fourth purpose is to make sure that they're either completed or on track in relation to any other tasks they may have been given. So if you've required a student, for example, to deliver a seminar paper, the question is, have they done that or not? And it's important to note that we do require these to take place annually up until the point at which they've submitted the intention to submit form and are therefore in the final stage going up to their thesis. But until that point, they must go through these reviews every year. This slide runs through the outcomes, and you'll see these are the typical outcomes, and the next slide talks about exceptional outcomes. And the typical outcomes as follows are four. One is progress satisfactory, which means that the student is on track in all aspects and therefore they're eligible to register for the next academic session. The second outcome, which is rather more positive than that even, is that the progress is satisfactory and the research skills are complete. Now this is typically for those students who are very close to submitting their intention to submit form, and this basically means they're on track and there's nothing more they need to do for research skills. So as soon as the Director of Studies authorises the intention to submit form, they can go ahead. So they're very close to the final stage. The third outcome is rather less positive, and this is progress not yet satisfactory. And this means that students would be required to do more work, typically for September. And the rule is that students only have one opportunity to be reassessed each year, which means that in September, progress not satisfactory is no longer available. It's a simple choice at that point between satisfactory or not. And if you put a student in the not yet satisfactory outcome, you would be expected to tell students which aspects need further attention, which could be any or all of the elements referred to on the previous slide. And my advice to supervisors is, if you are not entirely satisfactory, or if you're not entirely satisfied with the student's progress, then I would put them in this category. It's better to pick up problems now than to leave it until a more substantial event comes along later on. Now, the fourth outcome, which is less positive still, is progress not satisfactory, which means that studies will be terminated, or in some cases that students on a PhD would have to re-register for an MPhil. Now, normally students wouldn't get that unless they'd first of all been given a not yet satisfactory outcome, but it is possible under some circumstances to move straight to that outcome.
Neil, when we talk about the reassessment in September, am I right in thinking that annual monitoring happens at the same point each year? Is that how it works?
Yes. The timescales are typically in sort of starting in June and working through the Board of Examiners in July, and that will be the case for all students, irrespective of whether they started in October or February. They would still have their first annual monitoring at the same point. Now, this slide completes the discussion of outcomes of these reviews by talking about the other outcomes which are possible. And the other outcome is decision deferred, and this is sometimes used in July to defer a decision until September. Now, normally this is because the student was unable to participate because, for example, they were ill or had other personal circumstances. In this case, the September will be treated as the first submission rather than a resubmission. However, if the student is still unable to participate in September, the advice is, rather than deferring again, the board may advise the student to interrupt studies, because at that point there would have been several months in which they were effectively away from their studies. And the final report here reiterates advice from other presentations as well, that if a student is not well, or if a student has other personal issues, they really ought to talk to their Director of Studies, make sure the Director of Studies is aware of the problem and discusses the best way forward rather than leaving it. Okay. Now, the final part of the annual progress reviews presentation concerns the process. And this process has been made more rigorous in the last year or two. So, the first thing is that before June, Directors of Studies should discuss with their students exactly what they want the students to do and by when. And we'll see in a minute there is a little bit of flexibility for Directors of Studies in this respect. But it is important to note that we expect the full supervisory team to be involved in this discussion, either in person or at least by virtue of having been informed by the Director of Studies of what has been said, so that there's no scope for miscommunication between different people. And then the deadline is the mid of June for the next part of this. The date will vary from year to year, but it's typically mid-June. By this stage, students are expected to send their Director of Studies by email 3 things. First of all, an up-to-date research skills record. Secondly, the full supervisory log, which will contain the contents of and action points from each of the formal supervision meetings. But thirdly, a short review paper. Now, this is written especially for the review. It is roughly 2,000 words, and it needs to do 2 things. First of all, it summarises key conclusions, progress made, achievements made, and challenges overcome in 2014-15, the current year, but also outlines a proposed programme of research and issues which need to be addressed in the coming academic year. Now, Directors of Studies can decide exactly what they want the students to do at this point, which is why it's important before June for the Directors of Studies to let students know exactly what is expected of them. Following this, in early July, the student is required to attend an annual monitoring interview. And the Code of Practice indicates that this must be arranged by the Director of Studies. It should be in a normal supervision session, but this is one of the supervision sessions in which the full supervisory team is expected to be present, although it can be held by Skype if necessary. It's important for the full supervisory team to interview the student. And the aim of the interview is to discuss the documents the student has produced, especially the review paper. And then, clearly, by the same timescale after the interview, the supervisory team, led by the Director of Studies, will form a recommendation and will complete a standard form. So what happens to that standard form? Well, basically, a week later, each faculty will hold an annual monitoring panel, and the panel will discuss the recommendations on each form and decide whether to confirm them. Now, all supervisory teams in the faculty will be represented. There will be an independent chair to ensure equity across teams. If the person chairing most of the meeting is also the supervisor of one of the students in the faculties, then that person will have to stand down and replaced by another independent chair for the period in which their students are being considered. The panel will scrutinise the documents, and this is important. This is to make sure that similar documents are leading to similar outcomes across students, to make sure that there is equity across the faculty. And in the case of our partner institutions, this process will be conducted in liaison with the Liverpool Hope moderator. After that, in late July, the Liverpool Hope's Progression and Award Board will meet to confirm the outcomes. Now, the board will not receive all the documents prepared by the student, but the board will receive recommendations from each faculty, will seek an assurance from each faculty that due process has been followed, and will pick up any trends in terms of variation across faculty in terms of the outcomes. And once the board is satisfied that due process has been followed, it will confirm the outcomes, and Liverpool Hope University will then formally issue the results to students. So the final part of this presentation considers the confirmation of registration process. And the first slide here defines what this is about and runs through the process. So this is a formal review. It's undertaken to confirm that the student may remain registered for a PhD. It could be linked with the annual reviews if that's appropriate, but it doesn't have to be. And effectively, it's a very substantial amount. It is similar to upgrade events in those universities which require students initially to be registered for an MPhil. There is a rule about how long students may remain registered before this takes place, and that is that this must be held within 2 years of initial registration for full-time students, or for part-time students within 4 years of initial registration. And the slide here gives indications of the timescales. But it's important to be clear that it must take place according to these timescales, irrespective of the progress students have made. So the student not having made sufficient progress to demonstrate that they are achieving the expectations of a PhD is not a reason for postponing the outcome, although it may be a reason for less than positive decision to be made as a result of the interview. So what is the process? Well, first of all, a panel is established for this, and this will be the full supervisory team plus an independent reader who is to chair the process. And this is really important, having an independent reader who is independent of the process and who is therefore coming in at this point, but as someone who, with experience of bringing PhD students to completion, who can provide external guidance to confirm the student is making appropriate progress.
Can I just ask Neil, in terms of normally an independent chair is just independent and doesn't take a view on it. With the independent reader, does that suggest that they actually are involved in reading the materials and forming part of the outcome?
Yes, the independent reader is very different from the independent chair of the final oral examination. The independent chair of the final oral examination simply chairs the examination and makes sure the due process is followed. The independent reader here reads the full proposal and forms judgment about it as well. Okay. So before the interview takes place, the student is required to submit a very substantial confirmation proposal, about 20,000 words or equivalent. And the panel's decision must be made both on a scrutiny of the proposal and on the student's performance in the confirmation interview. And you can see this is starting to look a little bit like a dry run for the final Viva. And sorry, yes.
One of the things that I get asked a lot about the confirmation proposal, because the 20,000 words is quite a significant amount for the student to write. It's not a new piece of writing, is it? It can be based on things that they've already written, chapters and such, but they just form a narrative around it.
Yes, and exactly the precise nature of the proposal may vary from student to student, but you're absolutely right. It's perfectly possible for students to pull into this documents they've already produced for other purposes. And the final point just emphasises that the panel make a recommendation, and that recommendation is approved by Liverpool Hope University's Progression and Award Board. I've given the months on the screen here, which indicate when the board meets, and you may wish to take that into account when determining the dates of the confirmation interviews. So, what are the possible outcomes of this? And there are basically 4 outcomes. First of all, progress satisfactory and registration is confirmed. Hopefully that is the outcome most students will get, and at this point all subsequent annual registrations would be for a PhD, and most students get that outcome. Secondly, there may be an outcome of progress only satisfactory for an MPhil, and with this outcome the student would be required to change registration to MPhil, and they'll be required to remain on MPhil registration for the rest of their studies. Alternatively, we could have a further assessment required outcome. This means that students would remain registered for a PhD for 1 further year, but would be required to undertake a further review. And there is only 1 such further review allowed, and after that, the registration must either be confirmed as PhD or changed to MPhil, or studies must be terminated. And the final outcome is progress not satisfactory, studies terminated. This would be very rare, at least on the first occasion, but it does happen occasionally. I mean, clearly this, yes, that's fine.
Okay, thank you very much, Neil. If you would like any further information about this, it can be found on our web pages, as you can see there. You can also contact your PGR coordinators or the Hope moderator for additional queries. In the next session, we'll be looking at examination and appeals and some other key contacts that will be helpful for you to know at Liverpool Hope.